The Serious Accidents Punishment Act went into effect in January this year as part of efforts to address occupational accidents amid relentless reports of tragic fatalities at workplaces. So what have been the implications of this act at workplaces thus far? How are Korea's counterparts tackling corporate manslaughter? And is there a way to enhance existing efforts to prevent workplace tragedies? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we address efforts here and elsewhere to tackle workplace tragedies. For more, I have Mr. Marc Baek, that is, an attorney from the law firm Jipyong. Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Baek.
Thank you for having me.
Right, I also have Professor Victoria Roper at Northumbria Law School over in the UK. Professor Roper, it's a pleasure.
Thank you. Greetings from the UK.
Right. Mr. Baek, let's start here in the studio. Let's begin then with very few words on the Serious Accidents Punishment Act, which went into effect at the start of this year.
So let me first read you the first article of the law because it usually describes the purpose of the law. So the Article 1 of the law says its purpose is to prevent serious accidents and protect the lives and physical safety of citizens and workers by prescribing the punishment of business owners, responsible management officers, public officials, and corporations that have caused casualties in violation of their duties to take safety and health measures. So the law divides the serious accident into two. The first one is serious industrial accident, and the next one is serious civic accident. And it requires the business owners and the public officials to first establish safety and health management system, like human resources and budgeting and procedures to prevent serious accidents, and also they requires them to follow duties from the safety and health statutes and regulations. And as for the punishment is if there's any death casualty, it's 1 year of imprisonment at least, and there's a fine up to 1 billion won. And for other accidents, it is up to 7 years of imprisonment and 100 million won for the fine. And I think we can compare that to OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act we already had before. And the SAPA expanded the scope of the responsible from the safety managers to all the way top to the CEOs and business owners. And also it raises the degree of the punishment for the business owners.
Right, I see. And Professor Roper, the UK, for its part, has had the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act since the year 2008. Could you tell us a bit about this particular act and perhaps about the broader efforts there to crack down on workplace tragedies?
Yes, so our legislation was introduced to complement our existing health and safety law. It was designed to help prevent work-related accidents, and it is designed to punish the very worst corporate offending leading to deaths. It is widely drafted, so whilst it covers work-related fatalities, it is wider than that, encompassing other types of deaths caused by companies. However, primarily prosecutions have been of work-related deaths. As far as I'm aware, the UK is the first country in the world to introduce a specific offence and to enforce it with a degree of regularity. So we have had over 30 successful convictions of companies under the Act. The primary penalty is an unlimited fine, so there is no cap on the amount of fine that can be imposed. And recently we've seen fines in the region of £2 million, which I believe is approximately 3.1 billion won.
Right, I see. And back here on the local front, Mr. Baek, tallies for the first 8 months of this year show 432 people lost their lives at the workplace, and this tragic toll is reportedly quite similar to that recorded prior to the implementation of the Serious Accidents Punishment Act. First, then, how does Korea's death toll within the workforce compare to that of its counterparts? And second, simply speaking, is this law serving to deter workplace tragedies?
So first, as you mentioned, the tally is 432 this year until now, and I think it's until August actually. And then compared to last year, it was 441, so it's only 9 deaths decreased. And comparing with other countries, the number of industrial deaths per 10,000 people in Korea is 0.43. And the average, the OECD average is 0.29. And then compared to Japan and Germany, where they have like the structures of industry, in Japan the number is 0.13, and in Germany it's 0.15. So I think we can say that we're still, it has been decreasing over the years, but still, it's still far behind compared to other countries. And compared to the international standards. And as to answer your second question as to why we don't see any dramatic changes, I think the first reason is that it's just too early for us to find it out, because the law has been implemented since just January this year, so it's only been about 9 months. So I think it's too early to find that out, and I think we need to see at least a year or two to see any dramatic changes. And the second one is the part of the law is too vague for the companies, so companies are having some hard time to actually follow the instructions from the law. And then lastly, currently the law applies to only workplaces with less than 50 employees. And then statistics shows us that most the industrial casualties come from the smaller companies. So I think that is another reason why we don't see any dramatic changes until now.
Right, I see. So at the moment, this particular law targets companies that have workers 50 or more then?
That is for now, but in 2024, it's going to be expanded to workplaces with less than 50 and more than 5.
Right, I see. And Professor Roper, for the sake of comparison, what can you tell us about the number of workplace fatalities that in the UK since the start of your law, and that began, of course, in 2008 up until now? You spoke about 30 convictions thus far, right?
Yes, so because the offence was designed for only the worst cases leading to death, it was never envisaged that it would be used to prosecute every death that occurred at work, but the very worst cases. In terms of deaths at work, the UK does have a relatively low work-related fatality rate. So we do have reliable statistics. So in 2006-2007 reporting year, which was around the time the Act was passed into legislation, we had 247 deaths at work in the entire year. Now, our statistics are worked out on a per 100,000 workers basis, rather than, I believe the statistics just cited were per 10,000. So that rate would be 0.84 per 100,000 workers in around 2006, 2007, or less than 1 worker a year died per 100,000 workers. But that rate has gone down over the 14 years that the Act has been enforced. So more recently, in 2020, 2021, 142 workers died over the course of that year. And the rate would be 0.44 per 100,000 workers. So more or less a halving of the absolute number and the rate of work-related deaths in that 14-year period.
Right, I see. And Mr. Baek, back here in South Korea, labor groups claim that the Serious Accidents Punishment Act has limitations. Do you care to elaborate? So the labor side's main argument is that, like I just mentioned, it only applies to the workplaces with less than 50 employees for now. And then even after 2024, it applies until the January 2024. And even after January 2024, the law applies only to the workplaces with more than 5 employees. So that is the main concern for the labor, and because they argue that most of the death casualties in the industrial settings come from those like smaller companies. So that's the main argument from the labor side. Right, I see. And Professor Roper, I understand efforts were made over the course of time to render the corporate management, the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act more effective. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, this centred primarily on sentencing and sentencing guidelines. So We use sentencing guidelines in the UK to provide help to judges in terms of determining the appropriate penalty once a company or offender has been convicted. Initially, our sentencing guidelines were they were not linked to the turnover of the company in question, and they lacked some detail. And this led to inconsistency in sentencing and some fines which were seen as being too low in the circumstances. So in 2016, the sentencing guidelines were revised and made much more detailed. And these now do link the level of fine to the turnover of the offender. So the larger the turnover, the larger the fine that can be expected. And there are specific guidelines depending on whether the company is classified as small, medium, large, or very large. This has led, my research suggests, to greater consistency in fines and generally higher fines than we initially saw when the Act was first introduced.
Right, I see. Mr. Baek, beyond labor groups here in South Korea, management say that the Serious Accidents Punishment Act may serve to lead to unfair rulings for those in charge. Do you care to elaborate on this?
So there are two main arguments from the management side, and one is that the law is unclear, and then the other one is that it's too strong. For example, for the unclear part, they say the duties under safety and health-related statutes and regulations, they need to keep that provision, but then the law does not specify what kind of laws are included in those statutes and regulations. So it could be, obviously, it could include OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, but we don't know whether the Labor Standards Act will be included in the list because that law also specified the requirements for the safety measures for the workers. And what about the Equal Employment Act, because that also specified the requirements regarding the health of the female workers, so things like that. So they have concerns over whether what kind of law should be included in the list when the law does not specify the list of the statutes and regulations. And another example would be that they are responsible for a business and place of businesses that they actually operates, manages, and controls. But then the controls, manages, and operates, they're confused over what kind of scope they need to consider, whether about what the word means, just for now. So, and those could be the arguments from the management side. So actually the first SAPA case is actually on trial right now, and then the defendant applied for the constitutional review, whether on the grounds that it is too ambiguous and it is too strong.
Right, I see. Professor Roper, I understand this might be a difficult question, but what are your thoughts on Korea's legislation to ensure workplace safety?
Yes, so I think it's obviously good that legislation has been introduced in an attempt to improve health and safety. And certainly when I visited Korea in the summer, I could see that there was a real desire to improve health and safety. I think the comments about it taking time to see changes are completely correct. I would also say that the introduction of one piece of legislation, I think kind of corporate manslaughter legislation or similar legislation, is only really one piece in the health and safety puzzle. And it can take other efforts in terms of changes to other health and safety legislation, health and safety culture, and enforcement environment to see the kind of real drastic changes I think that Korea is wanting. In the UK, at one point, we had a work-related death statistics that were no better than any other country. And it's actually been quite a long process to get to where we are today. So from introduction of legislation around health and safety in the 1970s, more recently with the introduction of the Corporate Manslaughter Act. But it is an ongoing process, I think, and sometimes there can be too much emphasis may be placed on one piece of legislation and the change that might in itself bring, I think.
Right, I see. Mr. Baek, speaking within your capacity as a lawyer, what needs to be done to render this particular act here in the country more effective, do you think?
So I think the first and foremost thing would be making it clear. Like I mentioned, there are some gray areas that the companies are having a hard time to actually follow the law. And if that happens, they will focus on just evading law evading the law instead of following the law and then just to get out of the punishment. So I think that should come first and foremost. And the next thing would be, I mean, besides the law, the smaller companies are where most death casualties come from. So I think the government should try to support them with the resources and money so that they can have the same capacity as the big corporations.
Right, I see. And Professor Roper, very briefly speaking, but we have about 30 seconds, I think. Aside from legislation, what else do we need to ensure corporate tragedies are eliminated?
I think the support is very important. The Health and Safety Executive in the UK has done targeted interventions with specific industries such as construction, working with the big companies in order that that trickles down to the small companies who want to emulate those larger companies. So I think targeted interventions and education and support is key.
Right, I see. All right, Professor Roper, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today. And Mr. Baek, here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, and on that note, we end Wednesday's edition of Issues and Insiders. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Thank you for watching.